All right, it's time for the weekly news update. We got a couple big stories surrounding the Supreme Court. Joe Biden just announced his preferred nominee to replace Justice Breyer's seat. And Steve, you wrote a couple of pieces about what that might look like in terms of the ramifications for guns.
Yeah, this is big news, right? I mean, there's been a lot of news lately. You know, we just had former NRA board members on to talk about the big news in that case, and now the president has made a selection to fill what's going to be an open vacancy on the Supreme Court, which is a lifetime appointment, right? It's big implications for not just gun law, but all law
Sure.
in the whole country, right, Jake? And so he made the announcement earlier this week. He's picking Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is currently on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. She actually just got appointed there last year. So It's a pretty quick upward movement for her at this point. Yeah, she had been on the D.C. Circuit Court for a number of years before that. So she's had a lot of experience on the actual court, but pretty fast move. Once Merrick Garland became Attorney General, she replaced him on the appeals court. And now that Justice Stephen Breyer is retiring, she's replacing him on the Supreme Court, or at least she's nominated to do so. And interesting thing about her, right, is her record, on guns, right? What do we know about her so far?
Well, it kind of involves a little bit of reading of the tea leaves because we don't have a ton of concrete info on guns. She hasn't really ruled on any big gun cases.
Mm-hmm.
But the sort of evidence we do have, she, at her hearing with the Senate Judiciary Committee to be confirmed for that DC Circuit spot, she was asked a few times about guns and the Heller precedent. I think as you put in the piece, it was pretty routine boilerplate type answers, very professional. She said she'd be bound by Supreme Court precedent. So nothing groundbreaking there. But some interesting things about, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just saying just some interesting things about her background. The fact that she was a career federal public defender for a long time has some possibly interesting implications for how she might view guns. We've seen several instances in the last year or so from public defender organizations becoming increasingly vocal about gun control policies and how they see that affecting the criminal justice system. So if she shares in that at all, there could be some interesting insight to have that voice on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, absolutely. She said in these written responses to, it was actually Senator Durbin specifically, who's a Democrat, which actually made some of the questions kind of fascinating, because one of them was like, how are you going to assure people that you're going to defend the Second Amendment? And this was a question from the Democrat on the Judiciary Committee chairman. And one of her answers is very telling on its face, at least, because she said specifically that she did affirm the individual right to keep and bear arms is protected by the Second Amendment, because that's what the precedent is under Heller. So she said this explicitly, which is interesting. But the gun groups all had significant reactions to this. You had the gun control groups all cheering the nomination, based basically exclusively off of what the fact that President Biden is the one who made it, right? And President Biden is very committed to gun control advocacy and wants to see a whole host of new gun bans and restrictions on ownership put into place. And so effectively they're saying, here's a quote from Chris Brown, who's the president of Brady. President Biden has chosen wisely. We need a justice on the court who understands that there is no daylight between the right to keep and bear arms and laws that protect Americans from the threat of gun violence, and a justice who understands that the effects of our laws fall on Americans differently. While we look forward to hearing from her and those who know her in confirmation hearings, it appears that Judge Brown Jackson is such a jurist. And Shannon Watts from Moms Demand Action effectively said that we look forward to, quote, supporting Judge Jackson's nomination and call the Senate to swiftly confirm her because President Biden made this choice. So,
Right.
And then on the other side of things, you had the NRA, which basically took the opposite approach and opposes her being nominated. They said, quote, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson has never affirmed the Second Amendment protects the individual fundamental right of all Americans to keep and bear arms for the defense of themselves or others. Consequently, the NRA is concerned with President Biden's decision to nominate her to the Supreme Court of the United States at a crucial time when there are vital cases that will determine the scope and future of the Second Amendment and self-defense rights in our country. Interestingly, there kind of goes, at first it appears like it's at odds with what Jackson herself had said, because she said there was an individual right to keep and bear arms. But what the NRA means here, from my discussions with them, is in her quote, she's essentially saying she would uphold the precedent that the Supreme Court has already mandated, and that was in a confirmation hearing where she was going to be on the appeals court, which is subject to, Supreme Court precedent. It can't just override Supreme Court precedent. Now she's going to be on the Supreme Court if she's confirmed, where you can set precedent. So they're basically saying they're not comforted by those previous comments. But there's one more thing, right, that she did that might be interesting or somewhat telling in this whole situation, right?
Yeah, just the fact that she was a public defender, I think, is fascinating enough. You saw this in the Firearm Policy Coalition's public statement on her nomination. Yeah. I thought they had a pretty interesting statement, whereas a little different than the NRA or the gun control groups, where they kind of inferred based on Biden's nomination what the outcome would be. FPC put out a statement. Judge Jackson, who served for a time as an assistant public defender, should have firsthand experience of just how evil and corrupt the criminal justice system is, using coercive plea bargaining to avoid constitutionally required jury trials and putting people in cages for nonviolent possessory offenses such as merely possessing common semi-automatic firearms or carrying a handgun without a license. And then they list the states like New York and California where they have may issue laws and they do prosecute people for carrying without a license. So it is kind of a fascinating look at how some gun groups are reacting based on that experience. Yeah,
FPC seemed maybe more hopeful or reserved in judgment about how she might be on the court. And, part of that reason is she was asked in that same series of questions about her time as a public defender and whether she was worried about the fact that she helped people, including, quote, gun criminals. Durbin referred specifically to people who had committed gun crimes in this question about getting them off as a public defender. And she was pretty forceful in her defense of public defenders and the role they play in the criminal justice system. She said, quote, the primary concern of lawyers who work as public defenders is the same as that of the framers who crafted the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution, that in order to guarantee liberty and justice for all, the government has to provide due process to individuals it accuses of criminal behavior, including the rights to a grand jury indictment, a fair trial by a jury of one's peers, and competent legal counsel to hold the government accountable for providing a fair process and otherwise assist in the preparation of a defense against the charges. The Constitution guarantees that every person who is compelled to enter into the criminal justice system by virtue of being accused of a crime will receive representation in the context of their interactions with government authorities, and attorneys in the federal public defender's office perform this crucial function. So she is very defensive about her time there. She doesn't give in at all to this line of questioning that says basically you helped get criminals out of charges. Isn't that a bad thing? And she's saying no, which could play into that view, like you mentioned, of a lot of public defenders, that some of the nation's gun laws are enforced in ways that are inequitable or unjust. So we don't know, because she hasn't been a part of any of those groups who've spoken up on that point. But the other thing that I was going to mention is she also filed a brief for the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian-leaning think tank, before she was a public defender, before she was a judge. So she actually wrote a brief for a libertarian think tank. Now,
Right.
It was on the Fourth Amendment and it was on indefinite detention of terror suspects. Right. So not gun rights, obviously. And I don't know how much it tells us about gun rights, but the public defender aspect and the libertarian think tank history she has, that might give you some reason to think she's not necessarily going to side with the liberals in the court in gun cases all the time. At least some indication.
At least shows she's concerned and well aware of civil liberties concerns. Yeah. So, even if she doesn't 100% align with maybe the quote unquote pro-gun justices on the court, she might have a very different perspective just based on that background than some of the other justices. So it'll be definitely interesting to see if and when the hearings happen. I think they announced at the end of this month, they're going to start kicking off those hearings. Mm-hmm. And she'll almost certainly be asked about guns, considering there's a gun case currently before the Supreme Court. So, of course, we'll be covering what she says about that when that happens. And
yeah, definitely.
Should be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I wonder if she doesn't end up kind of like the center-left version of Neil Gorsuch.
Possibly, yeah.
Perhaps I'm understating the rest of her judicial record and, some of the ways that she's ruled in non-gun cases that put her on the short list for a Biden nominee. But, Gorsuch has ruffled feathers of, Trump supporters, despite the fact that Trump put him on the court, by being a sort of more libertarian-leaning type of justice, but from the center right. Whereas, one can dream, I guess, if you're a gun rights activist, that maybe that's how Brown will turn out, but Brown Jackson. But I will say that I have a member's piece on this, looking through in more detail about, how is she likely to rule, and given these things. And I will say that it's probably fair to look at how the gun groups have reacted and think that that's probably indicative of how she'll actually rule. I mean, she's a Biden nominee. Yes, sure. A big part of her nomination was that Biden promised to nominate a Black woman to the court. So his priorities were maybe less focused on policy outcomes. But I don't know. When you have the entire gun control movement cheering the nomination and the gun rights movement jeering it, it's probably a good indication.
There's probably something to that.
Yeah. We can't know, but that's the thing. When justices get on the court, it's a lifetime appointment. They're not answerable to the president who put them there or the Senate that confirmed them. So there's no guarantee she's going to be as favorable to the gun control arguments as the gun control groups believe she will be. But it's one of those things where we'll have to wait and see, but there are some reasons to think that maybe it won't turn out that way.